Good morning, or night, whichever the case may be. This is Sharon Alexander with Art with Alexander. This is something I've been working on for quite a while, and since I didn't really have anything else planned this week, I decided I would just share some of this with you. Now, this is a larger scale watercolor pencil and watercolor drawing. Right now I am putting watercolor pencil scales onto this tail. And I've got a whole lineup of blues and greens and purples off to the side, and I basically got them in a random shuffle. And just one by one, putting the scales onto the tail here, while my rabbit tries to disassemble the trash. Anyway, my thought behind this is that watercolor pencils are made to be soluble or dissolvable in water. That sounds kind of obvious, doesn't it? Why else would they call them watercolor pencils? So why am I putting this on first? Now you've seen me use these before to draw these pictures on, and the idea is that when they get wet, all of my markings disappear. In this case, I plan for them not to entirely disappear, but to actually smear. Because even though I'm going to put paint on the tail here, the idea is that the original markings are going to not entirely disappear. I'm putting these marks on a little bit harder than that, but that they're going to run a little bit. They're going to fade, they're going to bleed, and some of this color is going to mix and blend with the paint I'm going to put on top of it. Some of the line will remain, some of the paint will run. I'm hoping this will give a bit of an iridescent underwater feel to it, since it's going to be a little blurry. So sort of a blurry and defined at the same time, not unlike trying to look at something underwater, without filters and masks to help you keep the clarity of your vision, or to enhance it in the case of a camera. Because all of us are familiar with these gorgeous, crystal clear, crisp pictures that we see underwater of sea life. But without those filters, without those masks for the scuba divers, and even with the scuba divers, what they're seeing is not crystal clear. What we see in those stunning pictures and high definition photoshops is exactly that, Photoshop. Those are the results of somebody spending possibly hours, so I'm not downplaying Photoshop, possibly hours of work sitting there adjusting the colors, adjusting the clarity, removing things that they don't think anybody wants to see in that picture, things like that. In this case, I'm actually trying to add that blur. That little suggestion that this is underwater, this isn't completely clear, there's a hint of glint on the scales, and I'm going to use these pencils to add that iridescent rainbow that you sometimes see on a fish when you go fishing and catch it and pull it out of the water, and it's so pretty. Even though when you were looking out in the water, you thought, man, that dull, ugly, grayish, greenish, yellow fish. But then you hit the sunlight on those scales and you're like, ooh, that's actually kind of pretty. Shame this is dinner. Not really, that was kind of the goal, dinner. In this case, I don't think anybody's going to be eating the mermaid's tail. Don't know what that would taste like. Not sure how that would count as possibly cannibalism, since some of the myths and history that go behind the idea of the mermaid range anything from animomorphic, that's not quite the right to say, I can't get it out, but fish and other animals redrawn or reimagined in a more human nature is basically what that amounts to. Some of them involve, well, let's just say things that are not in nature. Pairings that are not in nature. Things that don't normally breed. There's also some mythologies where these were either cursings or blessings, depending on which gods were involved. And at least one story I remember hearing where it was a flat-out case of revenge, where the mermaid was a maid who became a mermaid and basically went out to take revenge on sailors. Some people might think of mermaids and be like, oh, beautiful mermaids. Mermaids with their long, flowy tails and their perfect bodies and their love of sailors. That's a bit more of a modern interpretation. Originally, mermaids were not pleasant. They were also known as sirens, and they lured men to their deaths. Yep, that's where that started. And then we had somebody make up a story. Some people might remember the story by Hans Christian Andersen, where a mermaid fell in love with a man, a prince in this case. Tragic story. Not nearly as happy as the ending you see in Disney. If you haven't read the story, I recommend reading it at least once in your lifetime, so that you at least know what the real story was. There is, by the way, a statue, unless somebody's decided to remove it, in Hans Christian Andersen's hometown, commemorating that little mermaid. Interesting stuff. Have some fun going down the rabbit hole with that. Our mermaid doesn't really have a story. She's kind of hiding. She's not really eager to be seen by anybody. And about now, somebody might be wondering what the purpose of this paper napkin is. Oops, I penciled down too soon. Grab back. This is to keep the oils that naturally occur in my hands, even though they have been washed, from getting onto my paper and causing my paints not to stick to my paper. Anybody ever tried to apply any sort of paint to a waxed surface? Pretty much the same result. Also about the same result as water on a duck's back. I'm sure we've all heard that saying, water on a duck's back. And for the exact same reason. Oil from the duck, and the duck puts this on. You'll see it grooming sometimes if you ever have a chance to watch a duck groom itself. Part of what it's doing is adding to and spreading oils that are naturally secreted by its skin in order to waterproof them so they don't get cold and wet while they're swimming around on your lake or pond or your fish pool if that happens to be where they are. Animals can be amazing creatures. And humans have amazing imaginations for what they do for them. For instance, the mermaid. There's several hoaxes out there where people have tried to make mermaids look like they were the real thing. There are actually people out there who put on tails and go swimming as part of their job to entertain people and to take photographs and basically make money on the idealism of mermaids, which have gone so far from their original intent, which basically was the ancients' version of a sea monster. A beautiful fish woman who lures you to your death in a very proactive way. There's some speculation that this may have also been some sailor's imagination after seeing something like a seal and just seeing the tail and thinking it had a very human-like movement to it. Oh, look, a mermaid. I've heard the suggestion that manatees may have also been put into this light. Kind of a fat mermaid, but if they say so. A lot of the older fairy tales have been given newer interpretations to make them all happy rainbows. Take unicorns. Unicorns were not always a nice, beautiful creature associated with happiness and goodness. That horn can kill people. And in older stories did. Hope those pencils aren't too loud. Leprechauns. Certainly not the Lucky Charms box character you see. I spent a while as a teenager going through some of these fairy tales. The kids' versions are cute. Cute, cute, cute. For those of you who don't want to know, enjoy your ignorance. For those of you who are now a little curious and don't know, please Google. Google is your friend, at least until you see something you don't want to know. Wish you didn't know. After that, sorry, good luck in forgetting. Some of the earlier stories of Cinderella, for instance. Ooh, yeah, that's some psychopathic stuff right there. Fortunately, fish scales are not. Fish scales. Probably, a lot of city folks probably don't see those since they only ever see their fish either in a package, in a can, or, whoops, sounds like somebody's awake. Just the hubby. But, yeah, fish scales. Fish scales are really interesting. You can actually tell the age of a fish by counting the rings on his scales. Just like the rings on, say, a tree trunk or a turtle shell, you can count their ages, how long they've been around, because every year they put on a new ring. So if you get out a microscope or at least a magnifying glass and get a big enough fish, you can count the rings on a fish's scales and find out how old it is. Iridescence is often caused by a natural slime that many fish will have on their scales in order to help them glide through the water faster. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? Some fish scales are big enough and rough enough, though, that you can actually use them as nail sharpeners, nail files. Isn't that cool? I remember a long time ago as a younger person, I actually had one. I don't know where it went. I believe it was a sturgeon scale. I might be wrong about that. If anybody knows what kind of scale it probably was, it came from Florida, or at least they were selling it in Florida. And they were selling them as nail files. Pretty effective, too. You might think, well, all fish have scales. So, not all fish have scales. Anybody who's managed to get a catfish would tell you they don't have scales, even though, in a way, they do. They're more like tiny teeth, just like sharks. Sharks actually have teeth on their skin. And it helps them glide through water faster and protects them from abrasions. Does not, however, protect you from abrasions. If you manage to rub up against a shark, it's not just his mouth that's taking your hide off. His skin will actually abrade your skin and can cause damage all by itself. Fish also have an extra sense. You always hear about extra senses, sixth senses, your taste, touch, smell. They actually have the sense built into them along little pore-like ridges along their faces and the sides of their bodies, depending on the species, that can pick up the electrical emissions from your nerves, or the nerves of fish. In some cases, they have the ability to pick up vibrations in the water. Pretty interesting effect. It helps them hunt and evade predators, depending on which species and what they're needing it for. Yeah, fish can be really interesting things to study. For instance, I haven't gotten the references completely together yet, but I saw something today by an artist who does nature-inspired pottery, and now my mind's lost the name, but it had something to do with wonder. And I can't remember the second half of the name. If I can remember the other half of the name, or I'll look it up when I'm done with this video, and I'll post her on the bottom, and you can look at her stuff. She's got some really pretty things. But the last thing I saw from her was a teapot set that she was taking pictures of by the ocean. And the teapot set was inspired from sea urchin shells. I do actually happen to have some sea urchin shells completely by coincidence. And I'll just pick one of these out and show it to you. But this is a sea urchin shell. They're hollow. There's usually a little piece that goes in here if you can find one completely intact. And these are covered in spines beyond the spines that we see here. They're very light, and you know, they sound a little bit like porcelain in themselves. But she had tea sets made to look like this. And she was telling a little story about how while she was doing the photo shoot for this, an actual crab in the tide pool below was trying to steal one of her cups. Had a hold of the handle and was trying to steal one of the cups. And I thought, oh, that is so adorable. And instantly the idea of a bunch of crabs having a tea party in a tide pool came to mind. I thought, ooh, that would make a cute drawing. Unfortunately, that was this morning. I haven't had time to go looking for references for what kind of crab I might like, insides of tide pools, miscellaneous seashells or whatnot. And obviously I'm not going to copy her beautiful little tea set. That would be copyright infringement. So I'll have to come up with my own design for the tea sets. Maybe just a common English tea set. Or maybe I'll have the whole thing made up of seashells. Who knows? Like I said, I only had the idea this morning, so I haven't had time to implement it. I'm sure that Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube here will probably be happy to show the world whatever I come up with. In the meantime, you can enjoy this image that I'm thinking about in my head while I work on that. And yeah, this is quite a process. I've actually been doing these scales for a couple of days. I hope it's not too boring just to watch me do all these scales. And hopefully the payoff of putting the next layer of paint on this, or layers, since I'll have a middle layer here of probably purple, one of the purples from the tail here. Maybe this slightly more shadowy color. Oops, and there went my pencils. Always making mistakes, always dropping things. But that's why we pick them up and go back to it. After that, there'll be a layer on each side for the shadows. Still trying to decide whether I want to put those shadows in with the watercolor pencils or if I'm just going to go ahead and do it full out paint. Winsor & Newton has a product that is an iridescent, basically gloss. It's a iridescent medium. I think you're supposed to add it to your paint to make it iridescent. Well, some of the reviews I've read suggest that it may or may not be really great being mixed into your paint, probably dependent on the paint. But I'm thinking maybe I'll get a little bottle of it and use it as the paint itself so that I don't have to go out and buy a whole new paint just to get the iridescence on the scales. Also been using some Winsor & Newton's Terra Verde to make the seagrass here, some of which is supposed to be behind that see-through tail. And looks like I'm probably going to end up adding another layer to that seagrass. Seaweed seems to be showing up pretty nicely, but the seagrass, not so much. So probably have to add just a light layer. And some of these are going to get darker as I move towards the front, because as I move towards the front, the grass should be lighter. As this mermaid evades our full glance, and the photographer of our memories and fancies says, "Whoa, what was that? Let's check the camera. Ooh, look at that tail. That's not a fish." I also have some bubbles from the tail, because water's never without bubbles if you've got things living in it. Granted, if there's nothing living in it, there's still often bubbles. Either way, water and bubbles usually go together. And then the background is going to be even more fun. Because if you go into water, it's not all one shade. Real water, is that an over? Yes, that's an over. Real water, if you go down, especially deep water, changes color the deeper you go. Up in the upper layers, it'll be just about clear to your eye. In reality, of course, it is all one color, it's clear. What you see when you look at water depends on the light reflecting from the sky off the bottom of whatever happens to be on bottom. If you're in shallow water, this is usually sand, and because blue is the fastest light ray, aside from ultraviolet, which of course you can't see without some help, mostly what you see is kind of a blue-green color, that beautiful turquoise color we all think about when we think about tropical beach vacations. The deeper out you go, depending on whether it's warm water like the Pacific or cold like the Atlantic, changes what you see quite a bit. Anything from a deeper color of teal and turquoise for the warmer areas like the Pacific, Bahamas especially. Ooh. Never been there, but the pictures, which are probably photoshopped, absolutely gorgeous. Maybe someday I'll see the Bahamas. Why not? My great-grandmother always wanted to see Hawaii. Same kind of area. Probably not something I'll ever actually see in person, though. I can keep dreaming. But if you go out to, say, the Atlantic, where everything's cold, the water is much greener. Which is an interesting question. Why is it greener? Why is the color different? I'm sure it has something to do with the animals and environment that color the water in the first place. Maybe someday I'll ask that question. Or my kids will ask that question, and then we'll both go look up the answers together. Why is the Atlantic a greener color than the Pacific? If anybody else already knows and feels like filling me in, that's great. If not, maybe I'll look it up myself sometime. I can use it as interesting trivia, maybe for the misty ocean. Let's face it, misty oceans are beautiful. Everyone does them just a little different. I've seen people do misty oceans and they'll define the waves and add metallics for the sea foam and all kinds of fun things. So far, the only thing I've really done is a misty ocean that when I got done with it, I thought, you know, this is kind of empty. What would I rather be looking at? And my answer to that was, how about a pair of migrating whales? And that was where the painting Migration came from, because I thought this ocean is too empty. There should be seagulls. There should be something, even if it's just a shark's fin. Instead, I drew a mother and baby humpback whale migrating somewhere with sea spouts. Pretty cute, and certainly a very satisfying picture to make. In fact, I made it twice because I thought, oh, this is so cute, I wish it was bigger, so I tried it again. Which comes up with another truth of the world, that no matter how much you like the first one, you will never precisely make it. Because I'll admit, I actually do admire forgers, especially the old ones who actually did their forgeries using paint and pen, because while old masters and new masters who do things feel like they're pretty good at what they do, and I know I personally have done things I thought, this isn't going to work. That's not going to work. And then when it gets done, I love it. Or at least moderately tolerant of it. But forgers, in order to get away with what they do, they have to get it right. There might be small indiscrepancies that they hope nobody will notice, but if they are actually good forgering, if that's a thing you would do, be good at forgering, since that's still bad. But they have to get it right. Because little mistakes that maybe a regular artist would say, oh, those fingers aren't long enough. They didn't get the angle on that right. Maybe the color's a bit off, but nah, nobody will notice that because they're never going to see the reference in person. Little things we nitpick at. They have to get it right because they're not doing it against what they are going to make. They are trying to make copies of the real thing. The world is full of museums holding copies. Some of those copies are several hundred years old, and some of them are legitimate copies made for the museums because Mona Lisa can't be everywhere at once. And everybody always wants to see and debate different things about Mona Lisa. There's even a debate as to whether or not the one you see in the museum is the real one, and sometimes the museum will say, no, that's not the real one. We have the real one. It's in the basement where light and air won't destroy it, or at least make it any worse, but the one you're actually seeing is forgery. They'll call it a copy because they're not selling it, but it's still a forgery. And it might even be painted by hand by a professional forger or a professional historian, depending on who you want to ask and what angle they want to take with it. But yeah, museums everywhere have forgeries, and Mona Lisa is probably one of the biggest ones that they usually do. What usually blows my mind is seeing the sizes of the originals. I've seen photographs of things done by, say, Vincent van Gogh, Monet, a few of the others. But then you actually see photographs of these things in a museum with people next to them, and you're like, ooh, it's a lot bigger than I thought it was. Or it's a lot smaller, depending. I always thought Mona Lisa was a lot bigger than she actually was. She was actually quite small. Starry Night was actually quite huge. Considering his money problems, I kind of wonder who was paying for that one originally. Since one of the most famous things about Picasso was that he was not endowed with overwhelming riches. Reading his history, I'm going to say that he was probably also bipolar. Licking his brush didn't help because, especially the older paints, had a lot of toxic things in them. Heavy metals like lead, cadmium, cobalt. Those things mess with your minds. Now, of course, we have a lot of hues and chemically created compounds that have been painstakingly worked over by painting companies to try to mimic those older colors. Not just to remove the harmful heavy metals that are in them, but also to try to make them more light fast. Because that's another thing that's really interesting. This is something that would probably be fun to Google, but recently, in the last few years at least, someone took some of those older works like the Mona Lisa and ran them through a specific AI filter to try to remove impurities and changes in the colors and the yellowing that naturally occurs from the varnishes that were used to stabilize these paintings, to see what the original paintings would have looked like. The background for Mona Lisa was actually blue. Blue, almost like this periwinkle here. I mean, just blue. Crazy. And the skin tone, I've never really thought much about modern Mona Lisa, or maybe I should say the way she looks in modern days, but to see the way it looked when it was made, absolutely beautiful, I'll admit, it was beautiful. Lady with the Ferret was another great example. Nothing like the muted sepia tones that we see from a lot of these older arts in art galleries now. Art galleries and museums, they work hard to clean, to restore, to preserve these arts for future generations. But some things you just can't change. For instance, the original varnishes. A lot of those were made with things like linseed oil, egg whites, natural compounds that in and of themselves worked great. Unfortunately, over time, they also crack, yellow, some of the natural compounds get darker. For instance, the mineral used to make Viridian actually gets darker the older it gets, so that eventually your beautiful bright green becomes this kind of dull, dark color that's really hard to make out what color it used to be. Excuse me. Need to dust the house again. But yep, there were a lot of things that most people probably never know. They'll see a picture of an old master artist piece and they'll think, why did they use such dull colors? They weren't dull colors when they used them. A lot of the really good ones, Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, they had patrons covering their work so they could afford some of these paints. For instance, the, let me see, what is it? It's lapis lazuli that makes the color. And now I can't remember what the color is because it has lost my mind, as usual. Always losing my mind. Kind of hard to believe when I don't have one left. Ultramarine, that was the color. Ultramarine. Very popular color for, say, illustration. The old illustration for 1600s and 1700s, and probably before that for Bibles and other illuminated work. That stuff's expensive. Ever bought jewelry with lapis lazuli in it? Yeah, lapis lazuli. Ground, mixed with a painting medium, and that was the paint. If you want to Google the painting nun from Germany, you probably will learn quite a bit about that, because the whole deal was that they found little flecks of lapis lazuli in the plaque of her teeth. Because, you know, as a painter, back then especially, they would paint and lick the brushes to get a good point. Something that I have studiously avoided after reading some of the history of why this was a really, really bad idea. You probably have all heard about the Mad Hatter. And this started because of mercury in the glue that the Hatters used. They would go mad. Especially older painters from centuries past had pretty much the same connotation. It's why in modern times we often think of artists as being more than a little eccentric. The most recent and last truly eccentric artist I can think of was Dali. He was from the early part of the last century. From, he's from one of those Mediterranean countries. And he had some very, very interesting ideas about art and who should be an artist and what art should be like. Yeah, he actually wrote a whole book on it. Yeah, I think he was licking his brush a little too much. I mean, Impressionism is usually a wild trip for me in the first place, but yeah, Dali, interesting individual. And not just his mustache. I don't know how fun it would be for a non-artist to read the book of Dali that he wrote himself about how to be an artist. Basically, it reads about how Dali is an artist and how Dali conducts himself and does his things and what Dali does and where Dali's from. And yeah, you want an inside look at his mind? Yeah, fun read. It's also quite amusing, I might add. I'm not sure whether I would put it in historics, in history, in art, in fiction. It's certainly an interesting fantasy of his. Good fun. I just kind of skimmed through it enough to see that I couldn't stand to read the whole thing with a sound mind. Certainly don't want to do that if you're having a self-image problem with your art, because if you're not Dolly, then you're nobody. Yeah, he had things to say about art from other countries. He had a firm belief that you needed to be from the colorful Mediterranean coast, that Africans were too crazy, that people from jungles were overwhelmed. He did apparently like the work coming out of New York City, of all places, at the time. I haven't actually looked up to see who was contemporary with him in New York City. Probably should do that, just to see what it was he thought was okay in New York City. His idea on naps was really interesting, too. He decided that the way to nap was to hold a spoon, and when the spoon fell from your sleeping hand and hit the floor, it would wake you up, and that was the perfect amount of sleep. Yeah. I don't think I would try to expound on my life. The only thing I will tell you is that the only way I do this is when nobody's here. Started doing this while somebody was taking a nap, because this house is a sound funnel. I can hear people walking all the way at the other end of the house. I can hear them talking outside. I usually have a pretty good warning for when people come up here, and it's not a dog, it's just sound. Just sound. We had some rain recently this week. Wonderful stuff. Everything outside went from looking like we're on the edge of the Sahara Desert, or to becoming the Sahara Desert, right back to good old Ozark jungle. Now you're sitting there thinking, Ozark jungle? What in the world are you talking about? The Ozark isn't a jungle. Sure it is. There are places out there that the only way you're going to get through is to take a machete with you. Briars, Japanese wisteria, yes, invasive, delicious, wonderful smelling Japanese wisteria. Not wisteria, Japanese honeysuckle. Japanese honeysuckle. If you're here in this area, you know what I'm talking about. I have seen Japanese honeysuckle as thick as my wrist going up into the trees. Wonderful stuff, but it's not really easy to walk through if you're in an area that's thick with it. At least I don't have kudzu. Of course, having goats probably makes sure that there's no kudzu. I don't currently have any goats, but I remember reading an article years back about farmers in, I believe it was Tennessee, that were basically renting their goats to eat kudzu to try to keep the stuff down. Another one of those fun things that people brought over from other places, because in other countries where they know about this, and probably the ones who brought it over, people eat kudzu shoots. Most of us have probably heard about eating bamboo shoots, but yes, you can actually eat kudzu shoots. And in some other countries, it is actually quite a staple of their diets. So there you go. If you're feeling in the need for greens and you've got a bunch of kudzu taking over your property, start eating it. Or hire somebody with goats to eat it. Your choice. They seem to be pretty effective at it and absolutely love it. They also love privet hedge, which at least here, I'm told in some places privet hedge is actually sold. You want it? Come get it. We'll give it to you for free. It's everywhere. It's as bad as kudzu. It blocks out the natural plants, which unfortunately blocks out natural food sources for bees and butterflies and other insects that are beneficial. They were here first for a reason. And while we may not enjoy things like ticks and mosquitoes, those are often food for some of those wildlife that we do actually enjoy. I know I love dragonflies. I did a dragonfly picture last time. They like mosquitoes. I actually kind of like possums, as long as they're not eating my cat food. Kind of cute when they're not hissing at you. And they eat ticks. Oh yeah, ticks. Hundreds of thousands of ticks. And while they can get rabies, they often don't. I've forgotten what the actual reason was for it, but there's actually a reason, a biological reason, why most of your possums don't have rabies. As a warm-blooded mammal, they're capable of it, but it's apparently so rare a thing that it's more likely that a shark's going to eat you. And since at least once upon a time the number for being eaten by a shark was 4 people a year out of the thousands and thousands of people who actually go swimming a year in the ocean, I'm going to say that that's a pretty small chance. Pretty interesting stuff. If you want to know what the biological reason is for that, go ahead and Google why possums don't have rabies. I read that on probably one of my scrolling pages for Facebook at one point, and I thought, well, that is interesting. Another interesting thing, at least I've always thought so, was fish bones. Fish bones? What's so interesting about fish bones? They get caught in your throat when you're trying to eat. Well, most fish bones are actually made of cartilage for the most part. Sharks are entirely cartilage. They don't have a single bone in their body. All cartilage. Especially that fin. All cartilage. Now, fish have a little bit more, and because of this, especially your canned fish is highly calcified. You have lots of calcium in fish. You also have omegas 6 and 9, all very good for you. But I remember at one point I had gone somewhere and gotten some fish bone jewelry. They're extremely light. They're almost like, well, they are like bird in some way, but I think they're actually in some ways lighter than birds. Maybe somebody could fact check me on that. I'm sure Facebook would be happy to fact check that for me. But at least to my hand, they felt lighter than bird bones of equivalent size. And they have a very interesting porous feel to them. I'm sure that there is a interesting reason for this. It probably is something along the same lines as the swim bladder, which is actually filled with oil in most cases. Many fish have what is called a swim bladder, filled with oil that allows them to maintain the correct buoyancy for whatever level of water they would prefer to live in. And it also helps them keep balance in their swimming, so that they're not swimming head down all the time or head up, depending on whichever part of them is lighter. Another interesting fish fact, they say that a fish has about 7 seconds of memory. And yet, there is a guy over in Asia who has trained his goldfish with the use of treats to play soccer. He set up a fish tank like a soccer ring, and he trained his goldfish to take a small ball and push it into a net. There's one on each side of his fish tank. And when one of these fish gets to that goal and gets the ball in, he gives them another treat. Which of course is how training animals works in the most case. You give them a treat. You treat every time they give a specific behavior, so that they will repeat what they did in hopes of another treat. So this fish that's supposed to only have 7 seconds of memory remembers it gets a treat when it pushes this ball into this net. Consistently. He demonstrated it on the video several times. Here's the ball, here's the fish pushing the ball into the net and looking for its treat. Thought that was pretty interesting. Mankind's always underestimating animals. There are people out there with the opinion that animals don't have feelings, and yet if you go and look at the animal kingdom, let's take elephants. They're extremely intelligent creatures, large land mammals of Africa and Asia. And maybe everyone's heard at least a rumor of elephant graveyards. They're not what people think. Elephants obviously don't dig graves. But when they do come across former family members, or the remains of former family members, the entire herd, even ones who didn't actually know them, will come up and use their trunks to pick up and finger and feel those bones as if they're remembering who this individual was. Well, some could argue that maybe that's not what they're doing. Maybe it's just another elephant, and they're like, oh, well, what killed this elephant? But it's, in some cases, you can actually see that this distresses them, seeing these bones, as if they're remembering this individual elephant and missing them. There are numerous stories out there of people who died and their dog either refused to leave their grave or would sit at that grave and basically mourn themselves to death. I know there's a personal family story of a dog and a cat who became really attached to each other, and one day something happened to the cat, and the dog crawled underneath the porch and died. Refused to leave. Stayed down there and starved to death because it missed its friend. I'm sure that we all can think of at least one or two stories like that, so anybody who says that they don't miss us when we're gone, yeah, sorry. There's too many examples of that. Now for animals that we don't interact with normally, like livestock, yeah, to them we are just a treat. Where's my treat? Where's my food? Where's my water? Where's the guy who comes and takes care of me? When we're gone, well, who's going to take care of me now? But the animals that we interact with the most miss us when we're not there. Personally, I could say that people really aren't that different. I mean, yeah, when we see a tragedy in another place, and a landslide or a war or a hurricane, and people get killed, yeah, we're upset. It bothers us. We look at their pictures, and even, whoops, there goes another pencil. And even though we've never met that person, knowing they're gone may disturb us, sadden us. We probably wish that nothing bad had happened to them. But it doesn't usually hit most stable people the same way as if it were your father, your first cousin, a child, your child, because we know them. In many ways, animals are just like that. And some of them can just pick up a new person and move on, and others never seem to get quite over it. We could all say the same thing. Some of us never quite get over it. Some of us will mourn husbands, wives, children, friends, years, decades after they're gone, or even just the ones who moved out of state, moved out of town. I knew one woman who apparently got pretty upset when her daughter moved into her house a block down the street. And then others just take a little time, move on. That doesn't say that they didn't like that person any less. It's just the way they are. They're not going to sit there and mope about it. Just move on. Sure, we'll miss them. Maybe we'll see them again if they're not dead. If they are dead, well, depending on your personal beliefs, maybe you will still get that chance again. But I'm not going to get into that because that gets into religion, and that's a hot topic that people get really grumpy about. And I'm not here for that. I'm here to block your view with a piece of paper so that I don't smear the rest of it, and share with you what I'm doing, which is adding scales to a fish's tail today. Who knows, maybe I'll even get to apply the color before our hour runs out. That would be nice. Because I try to keep this to an hour. There's a few people who have suggested that maybe an hour is too long. Fair enough. I'm sure that there's some people who don't have time for an hour. There are other people who really like the hour. And there are other people who go and watch not just the hour, but the entire project. Since I'm not cutting this, I don't know how to cut this. I might even have the software available, I just don't know how to use it. So instead of sitting there and cutting out chunks so that you say, hey, how'd you do that? You cut out a single piece that I wanted to see. Well, you can see the piece. Or if I'm taking too long and listening to me ramble on about whatever's crossing my mind doing this is getting boring, you can always skip ahead to the end and see what the final piece looked like. Assuming I finish the final piece today. Which obviously I won't. What you see so far is half of the picture, because the other half is underneath the stand on the other end of the board. And it's taken me, I'm going to say I've been working on this for about 4 weeks. Yeah, 4 weeks. Not, of course, like 4 weeks of me sitting at the table 8 hours a day. No, no, no. At best, I probably get 2 or 3 hours on any given day, and on a usual week, I might get 2 to 3 days of painting in. So, maybe a week's worth of work, if you wanted to look at it that way. Because as much as I would love to spend no less than 4 hours a day, every day, there's housework to do, there's kids to feed and keep out of trouble, there's laundry to do, there's animals to take care of, and once in a while I might even stop and eat something. I'd love to see comments at the bottom about what you think of this. Is this boring? Would you have rather have seen this from the beginning, drawing out the whole things, instead of just starting in the middle of the project? Would you have maybe have some other subject you'd like to see me draw? Maybe you want to see me draw out and do the idea of the crabs having a tea party at the tide pool. I probably would have started on that today if I'd had the idea yesterday. Which means I'll probably spend the evening after the kids go to bed researching crabs and tide pools. Maybe I'll have that ready to do a video on by next week. Who knows? Sadly, I don't live at the ocean, so it's going to be places like Pixabay, Upsplash, because I'm not going to get into copyright issues if I can help it. Even the first video I got here, I believe this is Jerico again, but the very first company I got said that the music I was using was copyright free. Oh well, apparently it wasn't quite as free as they thought, because YouTube decided that if I actually were at a point where I was being monetized, I would have been demonetized for that video, because 2 of the songs were apparently copyrighted even though they allow people to use them online. So that's rather confusing. But because they were allowed to use it online, I'm not being dinged for it or penalized or anything like that, oddly enough. But if I were making money on that video, I would no longer be making money. I have to admit that the copyright laws, especially in this country, are very complicated, and I don't fully understand them. I try to be very careful with it, but I don't fully understand it any more than I understand how to make art with a computer. Another thing I might do might be a short video later. In one of my shopping trips, I had been to the local hobby store, or one of the two that's available to me, and they had their brush pit pens on clearance. They were getting rid of them, weren't planning to have them anymore, which is really sad because I had a few months before gotten a couple of the black ones and really liked them. I like the way they feel, I like the way they perform, I like the fact that they have permanent ink that's archival quality. And if you're wondering what archival quality is, it basically means that they are less likely to fade anytime soon, as opposed to, say, a kid's brand of watercolor brushes that you leave it in the sun for a couple of days, and was there something on that page? I think I see a light line here that might have been dark blue. That's the difference between archival quality and what a lot of artists will refer to as student quality. This applies to paint, this applies to markers, this applies to a lot of things. And if you're wondering what makes it a quality product, basically it's color fastness in most cases. In some cases, this is also clarified, pun intended, by their clarity, because watercolors are expected to be very transparent. It's why they're often used for a lot of florals and things that you can see light through, because it's very, very good at conveying light and shadows. I know a lot of people like to do portraits with them. I'm not really a portrait person. I've never liked the idea of anybody staring at me from a page, or from the bathroom wall, or anywhere, for that matter. I don't mind talking to people, but the idea of their picture staring at me is just not something I care for. Maybe it's a little bit of phobia. Maybe I don't like people staring at me. Even if they're not even people, maybe it's just a picture of people. Maybe it comes from having animals staring at me, expecting something of me. I don't know. I know I've got a rabbit giving me the side eye right now. I'm not quite sure what she wants. She's got food, she's got water. She's being allowed to run around the room. Probably wants me to pet her. She loves being petted. Maybe someday we should do her picture. What do you think, Miss Bess? Would you enjoy having your picture done? That would be a bit of a challenge because she's black and white, and black is a challenge of its own, and white has a completely different set of rules. Ooh, did I just use that word? Rules. When it comes to art especially, I love breaking rules. But there are some rules that, believe it or not, have a pretty good purpose. Some of them are just rules of proportions, and some of those are actually pretty easy to break. In the case of white, I have found that the best rule to follow is that white is not white. White's not white. What are you talking about, woman? What do you mean white's not white? I mean that white is not white. If you take something that is supposedly white, you take this pencil for instance. In your head, you say, yeah, that's a white pencil. No big deal, white pencil. But if you really look at this pencil, you'll notice that the casing has a slight yellow tinge to it. If you look at some of the angles, you'll notice the shades are slightly gray, that the edgings that catch the light are just a lighter color than the rest of it. If you look at the end here, assuming the focus is good enough, you'll notice that there's smudging from other colors this has come in contact with. It's not very undifferent from saying that people are black or white. I once watched a comedy of a guy who claimed that he was not black. And then he proceeded to explain how he went to the paint store and proved it. He was mahogany. And I'll admit, he was a beautiful shade of mahogany. But that was our hour. I will expound on the thoughts of how to paint the colors of black and white later, maybe in something else. But our hour's up. So, if you've enjoyed this and you'd like to see some more of this, please let me know. If this was boring and you want me to move on to something else, go ahead and let me know that too. In the meantime, this has been Sharon Alexander for Arts with Alexander, and I hope everybody enjoyed this. Have a great day. Like and subscribe if you want to see some more.